All right. Happy Sunday, everybody. We're going to discuss a few different topics. So you're getting part one of, I think, what we'll do 3 parts here. So we'll have to link the subsequent parts into this video somehow. But to start off, the 3 different parts has a theme to it. I want to let you, Stanton, sort of address those themes because you sent a few different things to me, a few different concepts to me, and they go together perfectly. And I think that, thinking about those things is both your and my bailiwick. So go ahead with it. And after you do that, I don't know if you saw, I just put in that I'd like to talk about really quickly a current event. So you can decide which order you want to take those things.
Let's go through the themes that we were talking about. We've recently done one about families, and we're going to, including Hunter Biden and others who've been involved with addiction and treatment. And we're actually going to pick up with one of those again because they've been featuring it more. And then we're going to go ranch into something that's been in the news, what happens to youthful stars when they stop being children or teenagers or even young adults. And then we're going to talk about how to deal with your own child's gifts. What if you have a child who's exceptional or very much involved in something? How does that feed into an adult identity?
Before you get into it, let me get 5 minutes of your time here and it doesn't exactly feed into it, but it's something in the news. I can't think of a better time to bring it up except with the discussion with you. So do you mind if we do this? There's an article in VT Digger. It's actually a nonprofit organization, sort of like how Filter is. And it started talking about politics here in Vermont. And then it got to be one of the more prominent papers that people read here, the most popular ones that people read. And it's talking about how legislators in Vermont, many of whom I know, good people, good progressives, are trying to follow Portland's model, I guess you'd say, to decriminalizing drugs in Vermont. And they do 2 things in this decriminalization package that they bring forward, at least in the way that they publicize it. So all the good Democrats who are behind this, who are trying to decriminalize drugs, have a different bent that you and I are familiar with. One is, look, we don't need to decriminalize all drugs, but we should definitely decriminalize psychedelic drugs because they're not the harmful ones. Actually, you can use those medicinally. That's one bent. Of course, we have worried in the past that sort of idea could easily lead us to a Prozac 2.0, but with psychedelics. And Carl Hart.
Another point about that's Carl Hart's point is that's middle-class exceptionalism.
Exactly. Yep.
College people like to explore psychedelics and they like to disdain the drugs that were downstream socially.
Exactly.
Opioids and psychostimulants.
Yep.
And who made that decision? We joined him in being very skeptical about that.
Exactly. That was the second point I was going to make. It's exceptionalism. My drug's better than yours, and there are reasons why people think those drugs are better because they're drugs that people use currently that are not part of the downtrodden population. People aren't getting arrested for petty drug crimes because they use psychedelic drugs. They're getting in trouble, and that kind of population that's getting themselves in a lot of trouble, and the worst sort of consequences are using, the bad drugs, cocaine, meth, heroin, so-called bad drugs. There's another bent. Well, I guess this is not
say that they're, they like the population, and that population tends to get in less trouble with authorities, partly because their drugs are less disturbing to them. So they say, well, look at these good people, that must be good drugs. But those bad people take those drugs. But in fact, the data are really not that people are more compulsively inclined to take those, which is something you have a hard time selling in America.
Right.
Meth and heroin, drugs, Carl talks about this, aren't used any more dangerously. It's a question of who ends up using them and how those groups are perceived. And that's been going on for quite a long time, although only recently psychedelics have they're a fad now. My provider is NYU. They've got a psychedelic research treatment lab now. Everybody's on that bandwagon. They're writing bestsellers about it. Housewives are taking mini doses of LSD. God bless them.
It could easily become one of those things that, you know, people are still fighting for respect for MAT, but it's like, yeah, I mean, some areas probably there's still a draconian idea about lock everybody up and MAT bad, me good. But for the most part, it's that idea that people can do methadone and Suboxone is on billboards now, as you've mentioned. So I imagine same thing could easily happen with something like psychedelic drugs. But the push is mainly to decriminalize all drugs. And the idea, similar to Portland, as you've pointed out, is that they want to funnel people into treatment. In fact, it says this bill is a push. This is a quote from one of the senators. This bill is part of a larger push to end the failed war on drugs, which has disproportionately harmed undeserved communities of color. Fair enough. And then he says, our bill helps lead us on a path to decriminalizing substance abuse so that we can focus on providing addiction-related treatment instead of paying for jail cells and ignoring the larger problem. In other words, it's not that people want to make drugs okay to do because we're recognizing that that's something that people already do. We're not honoring people and their choices. What we're saying is, let's still make this something that let's continue with the idea that drug use is not an accepted sort of behavior, except instead of arresting people, which seems a little too harsh, let's do what we call helping and let's funnel them into a treatment. So once again, we have a story that sounds nice. It's being shared all around, and I couldn't help but offer my 2 cents that we are going to funnel this concept right back into everything American treatment industry.
Now, this feeds perfectly into Madeleine Dean and Harry Cunane. Perfectly.
Good.
Because here's their story, is that their Madeleine Dean was one of the House managers of the impeachment of trial of Donald Trump. But before that and going up until that, she's just been a model progressive legislator. She's always favored, improved education and better housing and better health care. She's, just a really admirable woman. And her son had been addicted to opioids for the better part of a decade. And now he was ashamed about it. But now he finally came out and admitted it. And when that happens, you get to put people in treatment, and he got better. So they're part of a long line that we've discussed of privileged offspring, William Cope Moyers and beautiful boy, Nick Sheff. We only hear about them, a lot of young people in that social class take drugs and maybe even have problems with it. They had problems for a while, all 3 of the people that were mentioned. Harry Cunane, William Cope Moyers, and Nick Sheff, but then they got better. And the Sheff story, as we pointed out, wasn't a rehab story, so that's not quite on topic. And here's the bottom line: they're people we hear about because they're good-looking, well-educated, good speakers. Harry Cunane's her son's a tall, good-looking man. And you like to hear that sort of a success story. But here's the problem with that success story and this whole storyline. Even though it took them a while, maybe longer, perhaps than it took Maya Salovitz and others, yourself, they didn't get better because they entered treatment. They got better because all of their analysis shows they have positive predictors of succeeding. They're better educated. They have more personal resources. They have a stronger family connection that's well intact. Those are the things that predict outcome, whether or not people enter rehab. And there's the mistake. It's a coincidence. I know this sounds strange and people will be offended. Madeleine Dean will be offended. No, it was his admitting he was addicted and going to rehab. That's what everybody has to do. And that's what I'm going to devote my attention to. get them into treatment. Now, there's besides the fact that the data don't show that treatment's the critical factor, it's the background of the person that's the critical factor. We do a lot of treatment. In the 1980s, Betty Ford made getting into treatment famous on a private rehab basis. But in the 1990s, that started shifting in a government direction. And this is the direction it shifted in. Keith Humphreys, a man that I'm opposed to now, he's one of the chief advocates and apologists for AA, as though that's our problems. We don't have enough people in AA.
Yeah, right.
He did a great analysis of how government funding was shifting from providing social services to treatment, even within departments whose goals were to help people in education, housing, and health and human services. Education, housing, and health. They were shifting money away from providing basic services to providing treatment. That's the whole direction. And so, in fact, Madeleine Dean is an example of a long-term trend. We're taking a longer look of things here, of Americans shifting the resources they provide, social resources, in the direction of medicalized treatment. It's irreversible. Poor little us and some others may have pointed this out. Keith Humphreys pointed it out, and now he seems to have abandoned it. And this trend is something that has negative consequences. And the negative consequences are obvious, because in all three of those areas, housing, education, and health, we're deteriorating, particularly a segment of the society that has the worst outcomes health-wise and in terms of drug use. I'll just throw out some statistics we've used before. Out of 196 countries measured by the global burden of disease, you can read about it in the 2019 happiness report, chapter 7. The United States has the most life years, quality life years, lost out of 196. They're number 1 for cocaine, number 2 for opioids, and number 3 for psychostimulants like meth. How's that possible? How can we be the worst? We're twice as bad. We lose twice as many life years as a comparable country like the UK. A second study that was published in last year, the Commonwealth Fund determined that of 12 advanced countries, 11, 10 besides the US, the United States spent by far the most on healthcare, by far, 50% more than who was ever in second place, and almost twice as much as some other countries. And we have the worst health outcomes, including we're number 1 in suicides. So what are the data are telling us that our overall trend in providing more and more high-end care, a psychiatric and addiction care, is having overall negative consequences for society. And even the man who wrote, a man I respect, an economist who wrote the addiction, chapter 7 addiction in the happiness report, ends up by saying, you know what? We need more treatment. And everybody, who could be against that? Who could be against more treatment? How could Madeleine Dean be saying the wrong thing when she says we need to get more people in treatment? By the way, her son is now employed in the treatment facility that he went to, which is the Karen Foundation. So it's turned out to be a good employment source for him. If you see those populations, they're upscale. And I not only did I run a rehab, but I was just I just added a section to my memoir. I worked at a place called Mathematica, and at one point, the president of our company, a brilliant, world famous statistician, had been drinking at lunch. They didn't consult with me. Well, I only worked there 9 months. That's my employment record, but that's another story. They did an intervention and they sent him to the Karen Foundation. Now, when you're a world-class statistician, and you had a major corporation, you have a good prognosis. You're gonna, chances are, you're gonna balance things out.
Right.
If only from the standpoint of saying, I got a pretty good gig here, in the family and a lot of support.
So they had a well-to-do guy send him to an upscale place.
Right. And she wants to expand it to send more, how can we call them? All those people who were dying due to opioids, the downstream social classes, the Appalachian, rural New England, inner city West Baltimore people. That's her concept. Let's get them into Karen Foundation, which is not going to happen. I mean, what we do is we start taking government programs, and instead of funding the basics that make people's lives work, we instead come up with the concept, well, they've got a disease and let's treat them. It's objectively wrong, and it's creating, and it's a snowball that can never stop. And Madeleine Dean, the most admirable person, really, I can't tell you how much I admire her and her recent activities in her whole life, is now on the bandwagon of diverting money from the programs that she's always emphasized in ways that she's not even aware of, how the funds shift, to putting more people in treatment. It's really going to help a lot of people in West Baltimore to take them out of an environment that doesn't work anymore. It's the murder capital, one of the murder capitals in the United States. There are a tremendous number of overdose deaths. People are homeless and without education. And let's take them out of the streets and put them in rehab. For how long? 3 months, 9 months?
And go back to where?
And go back to where? And to go back to what in life? And I want to contrast that with a group whose board I used to be on, called Above and Beyond in Chicago, run by some great friends of mine. The CEO, Dan Hostetler, is somebody who wrote a wonderful description of our relationship for my memoir. And they have a center where I've spent a fair amount of time, Above and Beyond in Chicago. It's a neighborhood of people, many of whom are homeless, many of whom are isolated. They don't have family connections. And they emphasize the 4 fundamentals of mental health and escaping, avoiding, and overcoming addiction, which are home, got to have a place to live, family, having intimate relationships, which many of these people have lost, health. It's great to put people into, the Betty Ford Center or into, Karen Foundation, but what about the people who are dying already, even before they get around to, let's talk about the drug situation. And then the 4th thing is purpose, which means both work and education. And those are the fundamentals, the foundations, the pillars that they're working on. And in a way that Madeleine Dean can't realize, I'll just say that I realize it. I've been writing about it for 50 years. Here's an open letter to Madeleine Dean. Madeleine Dean, in a way that you don't understand, you're part of a trend that's going in the wrong direction. And what you're witnessing with your son and with other people more even is the results of that trend. And they're going against your basic values. I know I speak about it a little differently than most people. You can look me up in Wikipedia. I've been predicting what's been happening and describing accurately which way addiction's been going for almost 50 years now. And you were part of a larger trend of disassembling. We had better social help programs in the 1980s than we do now, 40 and 50 years later. And primarily because we've been diverted by the concept that the problems we're dealing with are somehow identifiable as diseases that need to be treated in an isolated, hospitalized setting, as opposed to giving people better foundations for living their lives. So, Congresswoman Dean, here's my message to you. You might not hear it anyplace else. You're well-meaning. I admire you. Your son is a good-looking, intelligent man. I'm glad he's got a good job in the rehab industry now. but you're really disemboweling the United States and its whole social structure and taking that lifeblood and pushing it into treatment. Um, if not, I mean, the Karen Foundation's doing fine without your help, but spreading those, even the American government is now incredibly invested in treatment. It's not going to have the results you want. I would say something like further down the road, we'll see how negative these results are, but we're already clearly seeing these negative results. I'll just go over one more statistic, which she was interviewed, by the way. I saw her, they got an extended interview. I'll tie this into my life again, with Andrea Mitchell, who I graduated Penn with. And, okay, I'm privileged. Andrea Mitchell gave the graduation speech for my son when he graduated from Penn. And they cited this statistic. They claim it's due to the pandemic. It's not. Between May 2019 and May 2020, we had an all-time record for an annualized period of 81,000 drug deaths, which is 14,000 more than occurred in 2018. We're going badly in the wrong direction. And then they segue into saying, well, thank God your son got better at the Karen Foundation. Let's get more people into treatment, just like your son got into. Isn't that logical? Isn't that the solution?
Well, it's funny that it's not funny. It's interesting that what the concept of a disease comes from taking from the smallest percentage of the worst off population and then extrapolating that across everybody universally. And the reasons that we take for why the disease model works is taking from the smallest percentage of people who've gone through treatment and succeeded and extrapolating that directly across the other way, just layered on top of each other.
It's the small percentage who are become addicted, who come out of privileged backgrounds and were successful in good part because of that. And among other things that you and I know about a different world is you work with Families for Sensible Drug Policy. People, primarily privileged people. So they're already, have a hard time reaching out. I mean, there aren't a ton of inner city. Occasionally they get somebody from an inner city or a rural background, but rarely, for whom all of this hasn't worked, which is already the majority of people, even in privileged backgrounds.
Right.
So they, we're hearing a much, different narrative that counteracts, completely runs against, Harry Cunane and Madeleine Dean's narrative.
I've told you my rule about always giving a kid a push on a swing. The idea behind that is that.
Now, do you get strange kids pushes on swings, or only kids that you come to the playground with?
Well, maybe both. No. Kids under my care at a school. If a kid that I'm working with, kids that, this is not high school kids, by the way. I'm talking about like elementary school kids who are on the swing and say, "Will you push me?" We used to have this group of people who would just sit down drinking their coffees and come up with reasons why not right now. And it was a rule of mine to always give a kid a push. It's like a philosophy that is metaphorical. Always give a kid a push on the swing. And the idea behind that.
So it's why you're always going to have a job.
It's true.
You could drink some coffee, but you're employed. They've given you a job.
Right.
You're trying to do your damn job. You learn the value about that.
And the idea behind it is that the kid, when they ask for that, is expressing a need. Maybe they're expressing just a want, but in all likelihood, they're asking something that they kind of need right now, and it will help them in their development in funny ways. It's like relationship building. It's kinesthetically enjoyable. It's a nice experience, and they're asking, to be in your network kind of. So the risk of me pushing a kid on the swing and then it wasn't really something they needed is so low. Like, what would be the downside of it? That why wouldn't I do it? I like that mind. Just giving myself little rules and reminders like that keeps me from being awash in ideology that says you know, this way of treating human beings is better. It reminds me that the people who I'm working for are kids. If I'm in the addiction field, the people who I'm working for are human beings who have the problems. So it's never my job to say, well, I don't feel like doing that, and so how can I rationalize ways not to do it? How can I make life simpler for myself and just do other things that sound nice and look good? My job is to really work with those people who have needs.
And they're initiating the needs themselves. They've already gotten on the swing. You didn't get them there. They want to do that. So it's not like you're saying, oh, why don't you get on the swing? And the third thing is, kids have been on swings. That might go back to cave people or whoever.
Right.
I mean, that seems to be something that people like to do. That's a normal, it's good exercise. It's a way of interacting with other people who are on the swings and people who push them. It's a positive expression and involvement in the world. It's the opposite of therapy. You might almost say, well, swing therapy, I would call it, but then why desecrate something that's already naturally occurring?
Yeah, there you go. That's it. You know, I guess my point is people are asking for help in ways that, without that language, sort of all the tacitly saying, I have a need all the time. And the people who are tasked with trying to pick up on, well, what do people need, are never listening to those cries. And I think that people
they're they're looking farther downstream or making up syndromes where you're helping the basic process. We're going to jump to that in part 3. So let's keep to our schedule, half hour in.
Half hour in. And do you want to just go over what we will, this maybe a paragraph right now, but what we'll be talking about in the second episode? And as you're talking, there'll be a little video that people can click on to get into part 2.
We're going to be talking about something else in the news. There's some famous young people who haven't made it successfully into adulthood. Britney Spears is number one. She's a news item now. We're going to talk about that. And then in the third part, we're going to segue into, well, okay, what if my son or daughter's already starring in something like athletics? Is that bad, or drama or singing? Is that something I should discourage based on the Britney Spears story? So those are parts 2 and 3 of this cascading presentation, about which we're continuing, about the future of addiction and the future of our children.
So to get to that video right now, you're probably seeing a little video screen right next to Stanton's right arm. Click on that and you'll see part 2.